Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. It's really a great honor to be here, and over the last couple of days, just listening to all the presenters and just realizing the scope of interaction, of exchange that was involved actually with Martin and his collaborators. And it seems that those initiatives, many of them are still going to go on. And we heard from Bill and others about some of the projects. I'm here to very briefly touch on if you like, the spatial consequences or the spatial characteristics of contemporary cultural practice. So if we talk about what culture should do or what culture must do, what are the spatial consequences of such an act, such a kind of initiative, in a way? So during one of the few occasions when Martin Roth and I talked about ideas for future collaborations, he specifically singled out what I think turned out to be his last exhibition while he was still the director at the V&A, which was called You Say You Want a Revolution, Records and Rebels, 1966-1970. I think I remember him saying that this was one of his favorite exhibitions, if not the favorite exhibition for him, while he'd been involved at the museum. And I imagine that for all museum directors, for curators, each exhibition is essentially maybe also a favorite exhibition, but that may not be the case. But why this emphasis by Martin on the particular exhibition, You Say You Want a Revolution? The Guardian reviewer at the time called this called the exhibition that it was a sensory bombardment, a combination of music, style, and rebellious history. And it's this mix of political engagement and cultural aesthetics with a strong dose of joyous music, which I assume must have been the thing that mattered a lot to Martin and gave him a great deal of pleasure. But this attitude and this approach also, I think, typified his idea of the museum as a place of experimentation that considered its audience as participants, as collaborators who would in some ways be actively involved in the making of the exhibition. And I think a number of other speakers have referred to this transformed role of the visitor to a participant, to an active member of the museum. One of the innovative ways in which the totality one of the innovative ways in which the visitor might engage with the museum is through direct participation in the totality of its collection or its archive. And part of the V&A Reserve collection is housed together with material from the British Museum and the Science Museum in this building. And I don't know if it still is, if it's about to move, but this building is called Blythe House, and it's very close to Shepherd's Bush in London. It's an amazing building that's actually on a back street, but it's a massive building for the site that it is. It was built at the end of the last of the 19th century. It's a building from 1899 to 1903, and originally it was the headquarters of a post office savings bank, which now houses the material and has done so for almost 40 years. When it was the post office savings bank, actually I think there were a few thousand people working there, and I was told that men and women were kept apart in this post office during the time that it was open. But it was really amazing to get the chance to visit it. And this photograph that you see is part of a series that I was lucky enough to be able to commission a very interesting and important photographer called Helen Binet to go and photograph Blythe House. Then One day when Martin and I were doing an interview, he talked about the fact that, he said, today we use storage completely differently from the way we did 30 or 40 years ago. Back then, the museum storage facilities were like cellars, like archives, or places where you put objects and left them permanently. If you needed to find an object, and if you actually managed to find it, you would place it in a permanent gallery. And then I think he mentioned that it was the concept of the touring exhibitions, which became quite popular in the 1980s and 90s, that managed to use the material from the treasures of storage. But he said still a lot of work remains in storage for decades. Do you know the German word Findbucher? It translates as an inventory to be used for finding books. He said he liked this word because it's pretty esoteric and that it suggests an endless list of wonderful treasures that you might never find again. And I suppose in response to this condition, Martin felt that the storage facility has to become active. When you are conceiving an exhibition, you have a narrative, and you have to mirror that narrative in objects you find in storage. So museums need new methods to make storage easier to use, easier to read. We need different kinds of shelves, storage machinery that enables us to store objects in a compact, flexible way, but crucially allows us to access them easily. He spoke of the fact that he'd visited the warehouses of the very well-known German global wholesaler of nuts and bolts and fasteners, Roth, and he was particularly interested in ways in which technology would transform collections that have been essentially hidden from view for long periods. He was interested in how these collections, through technology, could speak to each other. A collection in Berlin with a collection in Mumbai, and how the visitor could then participate in forming their own collections, even their own versions of the artifacts through, for example, 3D printing, etc. This is the rooftop of this massive building that you see. And I think it's really apt that we are in this building, because I think both Blythe House and a building like the one that we are in Kraftwerk, give you a sense of the kind of potential of the infrastructure in a way that is needed for the kind of vision, I think, that was in play. Talking about a company like Roth, it's also like imagining Amazon logistics and the way in which access to the logistics of Amazon is also maybe has certain spatial characteristics and parallels of what the future museum or what the future storage space might be, and the ease with which places like Amazon distribution centers have learned how to provide easy access in a way to hundreds of thousands of different artifacts and objects. We were together with Martin, in fact, in conversation about how we would develop a series of what we call design studios at Harvard, which would essentially be a group of graduate students working together with a number of faculty and with the involvement of Martin and others from the V&A to really study and understand what could be a different museum experience in the future. But these ideas were not just technological imaginings, but clearly linked to very specific conceptions of the social, a geographical concept linked to Martin's commitment to taking the museum to the people. And just seeing some of the elements actually within Blythe House gives you, I think, an interesting perspective of the way in which such spaces could be imagined in very different ways as active spaces of participation by the people who are the users of the future museum. Design played an important role, not just in the roster of exhibitions, but also as a means to put into action, to conceive the radical imagination of Martin's spirit of protest, of dissent, against the institutionalization of society and of the museum. He himself, I believe, was and became a designer of these alternative future scenarios. It's a slightly different thing than a curatorial practice, which we use in the field of design also a lot, but actually to speak of him in the active role of being the one who's designing these future scenarios. Protest, in some sense, is an indispensable part of social engagement, not just with others, but also with society as is, by imagining what it could be. Protest and dissent, in its most productive manifestation, is always a projective act. It considers and constructs possible futures as a critique of the present and as a way of getting us to alternative futures. I suppose those people who are involved with institutions are always looking for ways to introduce or to think through what the writer and philosopher Edward Glissant has talked about, this idea of trembling thought that is never stable. It's a pensée du tremblement, which is also not dissimilar to the work of the Italian philosopher, for example, Gianni Vattimo, who talks about the concept of weak thought. So it's really this kind of thinking, the idea of the unsteadiness of the ground is a reaction to the notion of stagnation, of doing the same thing, of the continuity of a kind of very steady, very regular kind of practice. Unfortunately, time doesn't let us go into detail here, but Martin Roth's love and appreciation of the exhibition, You Say You Want a Revolution, and the period that it dealt with, 1966-1970, also coincides with the publication of a book called De-Schooling Society by the Croatian-Austrian philosopher Ivan Illich. Illich was an interesting and very unusual person, and he had this interest and commitment to what he called de-schooling society. Illich thought, and I quote, "Most of the research going on about the future tends to advocate further increases in the institutionalization of values, and we must permit conditions which would permit precisely the contrary to happen. We need research on the possible use of technology to create institutions which serve personal, creative, and autonomous interaction and the emergence of values which cannot be substantially controlled by technocrats. We need counterforward research to current futurology." It's the part in Illich's statement about the creating of institutions which serve personal, creative, and autonomous interaction and the emergence of values which cannot be substantially controlled by technocrats that fits so well with the idea of dissent in the work and career of Martin Roth. Thank you very much.